Hi there, and welcome to another episode of Therapy by the Book, the show where we take your favorite fictional characters and ask the question, what would it be like if they came to therapy? My name is William Haddad, and for today's character client, we have the expatriate and nightclub owner, Rick Blaine, from Casablanca. Before I go any further, I will say, if you are listening to this episode and you haven't seen Casablanca yet, stop. Pause right now, and don't come back until you've watched it. It's considered by many to be one of the greatest, if not the greatest, films of all time, and rightly so. It's a heart-wrenching story about lost love in the time of war, made all the more relevant by the year in which the film was produced. The gravity of its emotional narrative is matched only by its all-star cast. This is one of those rare movies that you really have to search to find someone who doesn't like it. Casablanca tells the story of three individuals, Rick Blaine, Ilsa Lund, and Victor Laszlo, and the chance fate that causes each of their paths to join, separate, and then reunite in a little town known as Casablanca, all set against the ominous backdrop of World War II. Little is known about Rick Blaine's childhood. He's from New York originally and traveled around the world a good deal. He's worked as a soldier, smuggler, and arms dealer, among other less than savory professions. But when we're introduced to Rick at the start of the film, he's currently the owner of the nightclub Rick's Café American in Casablanca. Casablanca itself is a remote town located in what was then French Morocco, and at this time in the war is still officially under French control, although the Nazis are starting to make advances. Its desert location makes it a hotbed for refugees trying to flee the war's horrors, and therefore an equal draw for rogues, criminals, corruption, and score settling. Rick presents as, in a word, neutral. One might even say aloof, indifferent, or detached, but the man himself would be unlikely to listen to you long enough to comment. Rick doesn't involve himself in others' affairs any more than is practical or profitable. He claims not to care one way or the other about the rampant corruption in Casablanca, the Nazis, or even the war, so long as they all let him run his business uninterrupted. At one point, a criminal in Casablanca named Dugarte asks Rick, "You despise me, don't you?" To which Rick answers, "If I ever gave you any thought, I probably would." On another occasion, when Rick is introduced to Major Strasser, the head of the newly arrived German task force, the Major asks Rick, "What is your nationality?" Rick's reply, "I'm a drunkard." And the French Captain Renault offers the follow-up, "That makes Rick a citizen of the world." A favorite line of Rick's personally that he says on multiple occasions throughout the film is, "I stick my neck out for nobody." But beneath this cold, impartial exterior lies a person who is actually quite full of feeling. As the story unfolds, we see more and more that what's really going on is that Rick, too, is on the run, not from the Germans or the war, but from his own wounded heart. Everything changes the night two people, a man and a woman, walk into Rick's. The man is Victor Laszlo, a brave and charismatic member of the resistance against the Nazi regime. He's been presumed dead on multiple occasions, escaped from a concentration camp, and evaded the Nazis ever since. The woman is Ilsa Lund, Victor Laszlo's wife and Rick's former lover. A long and complicated story of chance circumstance is what allows for this bittersweet reunion to take place. Not long after Victor was taken to the concentration camp, he was reported dead, having been shot in an escape attempt. Ilsa, torn by grief, made her way to Paris, where she met Rick. Both had their reasons at the time for wanting to be scarce about their pasts, and it may well have been this in part that led to their falling in love. At this point, Paris has not yet been occupied by the Nazis, and for a brief, blissful period, Ilsa and Rick are able to share a life neither one ever dared to dream would feel so good. But their happiness is disrupted by the encroaching German forces, and both make plans to flee the city together. However, just before it's time, Ilsa learns that Victor is still alive, weak, hiding, and in desperate need of help. With the Nazis on Paris's doorstep, Ilsa makes the impossible choice of leaving Rick without telling him why, in order to protect all three of them, and Rick departs Paris utterly heartbroken. It is this personal wound, above all else, that is what pushes Rick to adopt the mask of indifference, but we see at times throughout the story a flicker of the humanity beneath it. Captain Renault, who's the head of the French forces in Casablanca, knows Rick better than most, and he remarks at one point how he suspects, under that cynical shell, you are at heart a sentimentalist. And he goes on to point out that during Rick's previous work as a soldier and smuggler, both times he supported the side in the conflict that was struggling and more desperate. Later on, Victor Laszlo confronts Rick directly about this contradiction during the following exchange. Rick, don't you sometimes wonder if it's worth all this? I mean, what you're fighting for. Victor, you might as well question why we breathe. If we stop breathing, we'll die. If we stop fighting our enemies, the world will die. Rick, well, what of it? It'll be out of its misery. Victor, you know how you sound, Mr. Blaine? Like a man who's trying to convince himself of something he doesn't believe in his heart. Probably Rick's most selfless act prior to the film's climax is when he allows the husband of a young couple to win at roulette in order to obtain enough money to buy himself and his wife safe passage out of Casablanca. It's also worth noting that all of Rick's cafe staff at the time not only approve, but even applaud Rick for this action. One of them comments, "Boss, you've done a beautiful thing." Why does this matter? It shows that despite Rick's attempts to present himself as unfeeling, he nevertheless surrounds himself with people who are themselves compassionate. Ilsa struggles with her feelings about Rick as well. Despite the choice she made back in Paris, we later learn it was no less crushing for her to leave Rick, and despite loving her husband, she still has feelings for Rick too. It's a complicated emotional dynamic for all three, although in some respects Ilsa has it hardest of all. It's to Rick's credit that he eventually does as Ilsa suggests when she tells him, "I don't know what to think anymore. You'll have to do the thinking for both of us," concerning what happens next. Without recapping the whole story, Rick's character evolves from a man hiding from himself to someone willing to give up what once mattered most to him in favor of a cause that affects everyone. His final words to Ilsa and the decision to tell her to get on that plane say it all. It's a beautiful depiction of how sometimes compassion for others is the surest way out of our own mental prison. And the way in which the closing beats of this narrative unfold are, in my opinion, nothing short of breathtaking. Coming now to diagnosis, Rick Blaine's psychological profile reflects a complex interplay of trauma, adaptive defenses, and muted emotional wounds. My tentative diagnosis would be other specified trauma and stressor-related disorder alongside major depressive disorder with mild to moderate severity. This dual framework captures both Rick's hidden emotional injuries and the guarded detachment masking them. At a surface level, Rick embodies neutrality. However, beneath this exterior, we are given compelling evidence that Rick is still deeply feeling, and haunted by, his past. His self-made emotional rigidity and cynicism represent not just a persona, but a survival strategy, born from heartbreak and reinforced by the war. These external postures align with various overlapping symptoms for his dual diagnosis, including weary and stiff demeanor, indicative of PTSD-like numbing and hypervigilance, alcohol use, indicative of self-medication for emotional pain, common with both depression and trauma, emotionally flat disaffection, indicative of depressive withdrawal, avoidance of emotional involvement, indicative of trauma-induced isolation, and an erratic schedule and social habits indicative of both. A great example of this is when a lady friend asks him, "Where were you last night?" To which Rick replies, "I don't remember." When she follows up with, "Will I see you tonight?" he answers, "I never make plans that far ahead." Rick's diagnosis straddles both trauma and depression because both are at play. Trauma explains his guarded detachment, while depression explains his flat affect and weary disaffection toward the world. A dual diagnosis does not mean he is broken in two, but rather that his psyche has layered one wound atop another, grief and trauma walling up successively into a shell he can neither shed nor live within comfortably. While the overlap between trauma and depression is clear, however, the roots cannot be separated from Rick's history with Ilsa Lund. Ilsa's arrival rekindles all of Rick's unresolved feelings of love and betrayal. The flashback to Paris, along with the heartbreak of Ilsa's departure, is actually a great example of how a severe enough trigger can destroy all the careful walls and control mechanisms a person has built up in less than an evening. In Paris, Rick allowed himself to be fully open, vulnerable, even joyful. It was, by all accounts, the happiest time of his life. Ilsa's abrupt departure without explanation, on the very eve of their escape, marked a wound so deep that it shattered his sense of trust and left him abandoned with nothing but unanswered questions. This betrayal became the chasm from which his hardened persona arose. The trauma was not only the loss of love, but the shock of being discarded without apparent reason and being suddenly cut off from a future he had finally dared to imagine. In short, Rick is a man defined by contradiction, claiming neutrality while quietly choosing sides, swearing dispassion while harboring sentiment, insisting he wants no involvement while inevitably becoming involved. These contradictions are the essence of his suffering, but glimpses of sentimentality, sacrifice, and a moral awakening nevertheless point to an unfrozen heart beneath all the cynicism. Whether he will allow that wounded sentimental self to emerge represents the core of his therapeutic journey. When we begin treatment, the office is quiet. Outside, Casablanca hums with the murmur of music, trade, gossip, and whispered arrangements. But in here, behind the closed door of therapy, all is still. Rick Blaine sits, shoulders tight, jaw set, an unlit cigarette between his fingers. He has the look of a man who trusts no one, including himself, to stay any longer than he must. As an initial step, we allow Rick simply a chance to breathe in that silence, and to see that no one is rushing to break it. Much of Rick's life before and during Casablanca is both hidden and surrounded by masks. Sarcasm, indifference, grim neutrality. It will do no good to either of us if we try to tear those away right off the bat. With slow, gradual pacing, we establish that in this room there is no demand to perform, no expectation to play the aloof club owner. In order for Rick to heal, he must discover that he can let his guard down without being hurt. From there, trauma and compassion-oriented talk therapy as an approach takes focus. Over our early sessions, I gently offer him psychoeducation about trauma, how the body and mind can respond to sudden loss by shutting down, how withdrawal and numbness are protective but ultimately isolating. For Rick, hearing that his patterns make sense, not as proof of his cynicism but as survival strategies, could reframe his self-understanding. Instead of thinking, I'm just a drunkard who doesn't care, he might begin to think, I've been hurt, and this is how I've managed to endure. That shift alone is powerful. It defies the static nature of his inner mindset, and instead offers one of a man in motion, still capable of change. From there, our therapy moves toward exploring vulnerability as a strength rather than a weakness. Rick may have convinced himself that caring is dangerous, that to open himself again is to invite another Ilsa-shaped wound. Yet his own story betrays that belief. The roulette table moment and the sacrifices he makes for Ilsa and Victor at the film's climax both prove that empathy, far from weakness, is really his soul's compass. The goal behind illustrating this is not to scold Rick for hypocrisy, but to remind him that his best moments came from connection rather than detachment. Another crucial intervention would be a guided emotional exploration of Paris. That city is both Rick's paradise and his hell. As his therapist, I might ask, which sensation do you feel most strongly when you think of Paris? Phrasing the question to be open-ended leaves space for grief, nostalgia, anger, and longing together. Allowing himself to acknowledge the simultaneous existence of such emotions is an important milestone. With it, Rick can begin to accept the feelings for what they are, instead of numbing them away with alcohol and sarcasm. Paris cannot be undone, but it can be mourned and cherished in a way that frees him from the frozen bitterness it left behind. Of course, the story of Paris is not the only one that has shaped Rick. Eventually, we would also turn to his earlier history, his restless travels, fighting on the side of the underdog, and the decision to leave New York. These questions, why did you leave, and what draws you to side with the desperate, invite Rick to see the patterns behind his identity. Even in his smuggling days, he preferred to support the oppressed rather than the oppressors. With time and practice in therapy, Rick may come to own these patterns, not as coincidence, but as evidence of his true nature, a man whose heart cannot help but beat for what is right, even when his words deny it. The long-term prognosis for Rick is good. Unlike some other character clients we've seen whose traumas have been compounded by years of danger or abuse, Rick's cynicism is more circumstantial. It is the emotional scar formed over the wound from Ilsa's sudden departure, but his final act in Casablanca, sacrificing his own desires for Ilsa and Victor, shows that when pushed to the edge, he chooses compassion. Therapy could build on that seed and perhaps, in time, help him to draw from that same empathy not only in moments of crisis, but in the quiet rhythms of everyday life. Among the many themes of Rick's story is the one that, out of survival, there is often born possibility. If Rick can come this far with his insight, he may in turn reach a deeper truth, that sentiment is not weakness, compassion is not danger, and even a man who insists that he sticks his neck out for nobody might one day learn to live by sticking it out for everyone who matters. Well, that's a wrap for this episode. Thank you everyone as always for tuning in, and until next time, here's looking at you, kid.